All right, so welcome to the Counseling Delphi, Deep Dives for Counselors. My name is Gina Martin, and I am from the University of Iowa. I'm also an adjunct faculty at Northwestern University. I just want to start off by saying thanks to Dr. Marty Gensius, who's producing this effort and who's working tirelessly behind the scenes to make things work. So Counseling Delphi is a video live streaming show, and it's happening monthly on Sunday nights. Shows will be available later for viewing and also with a transcription, and they'll also be converted to audio podcasts set up on all major podcast services. You can check out the website at www.counselingdelphi.net for video and audio podcast links and more information about upcoming panel topics. Tonight's live stream is on the topic of neuroscience and counseling, where we have gathered a group of panelists who will do a deep dive to further understand and address future advances in neuroscience and counseling. So joining me tonight, we have Dr. Eric Beeson, Dr. Carol Seehusen, and Kiai Kim. This panel has been developed by people who are mutually interested in the topics of neuroscience and counseling. And we have some questions for each other. And then we will also be taking some questions from live stream viewers in the chat if time permits. So if you're watching and you have a question for one of our experts or all of our experts tonight, please make sure you put that in the chat. So why don't we all take a brief moment to introduce ourselves to the audience?
I guess I'll go first. My name is Kiai Kim. I am an associate clinical counselor in California and a national clinical counselor. And I am also a certified practitioner of emotional resolution, which is an alternative healing arts methodology that deals with somatic responses that come with emotions.
I'm Carol Seehusen. I own and operate my own private practice in Iowa. And I'm also working towards certification in brain spotting, which is related to neuroscience, of course, and I can answer more questions about that later.
Who would have guessed, Carol? Brain spotting, neuroscience, it seems to match, huh? I'm Eric. I am a clinical associate faculty at the Family Institute at Northwestern University in our clinical mental health counseling program. So that's how I spend most of my time and my day. I'm privileged enough to facilitate a little neuroscience integration lab there. We're in our first couple quarters running, but excited about the excitement that students are bringing to the field. So.
Love that. Well, thank you to each of you for being here this evening and for sharing your expertise and experience with our viewers. So the first question that I have for everyone is, what type of work do you do and how is neuroscience a part of it? Who wants to jump in there first?
Well, since I spoke first, I guess I'll go. So I work in a private practice. I also work with people. I run a nonprofit and I work with people on the street. And what I do that's related to neuroscience, I don't know if it's necessarily related to neuroscience, except that I've been doing research in neuroscience, just researching literature to back the theory behind what I do, which is helping people to resolve emotions by paying attention using interoception to the sensations in their bodies when they are feeling an emotion.
So paying attention to emotions within the body and things like that. Can you talk a little bit more about your work in your nonprofit?
Oh, well, the nonprofit's not even related to mental health. Well, it is related to mental health. So my nonprofit is about building affordable housing, and people without housing. It is a mental health issue. So I have been working with people who are homeless, just being out on the street and giving them sessions right there on the spot, using this intervention, this somatic quieting intervention, that's called emotional resolution, or MRES. And, people have really responded well. I mean, I've seen people just change before my eyes. And so it's been really effective. And actually, the people that I have used MRES with that I've seen on the street, I haven't seen them again. So I hope that's a good sign.
I imagine Kiai, like time is limited, right? So you need to interact with them in a very quick, brief way. So it's exciting to hear about some of the at least anecdotal outcomes that you're seeing there.
It is exciting. Yeah. I'm curious though about Carol's brain spotting stuff. I want to hear more about it.
Yeah, so obviously all I do is clinical work. I specialize in working with individuals with chronic pain and chronic illness, but I see obviously related with that so much trauma, lots of mood, anxiety, depression, etc. And so somatic work is super interesting to me. That's awesome. How I got involved in neuroscience was really when Dr. Beeson started Brainstorm. I got involved in that when it came out. And Gina and I talked a lot about it. We were colleagues at the University of Iowa. But then when I got out, I wanted to do, or when I graduated and got fully into my clinical practice and no longer studying and doing all of that stuff, I really wanted to do something that seemed more than just a traditional talk therapy. And so I was researching, EMDR is super popular out there, but there are so many clinicians that are trained in EMDR where I'm at. And so I wanted to be a little different, which is something that I always do. And I found brain spotting. And first I read the book by Dr. David Grand, which hooked me. And then I sought out the trainings. But essentially, brain spotting comes from EMDR. It focuses on brain spots, which are spots in the visual field where individuals connect to their body and an emotion. Say if they're coming in for trauma, we're working through a traumatic experience, and we're finding a spot where kind of their brain goes. Our brain is such an amazing organ that it kind of intuitively, if you watch people's eyes when you're counseling and sitting across from them, you'll notice when they're talking and processing about things that their eyes tend to gravitate towards certain parts of the field. Brain spotting really just enhances that and says, okay, hey, how about we hang out right here? I see your eyes are focusing there as we're processing through this thing. What do you notice? What do you notice in your body? And really connecting that, the emotion part to the physical part of the brain, doing that brain body work, which is amazing to do. And kind of healing from the inside out. And how brain spotting uses bilateral stimulation is we use bilateral music versus, the going back and forth that EMDR uses. So I don't know if that's as brief as.
So what is the training like for it? I'm so curious now because I'm thinking about clients who do that and I'm like,
Yeah, so it's like any other modality, you go to these intensives where, so 3 days, 8-hour days, 9-hour days, something like that. And it's both, lecture, getting the background from it, but it's a lot of experiential too. And so there's a lot of practice of me being a client, receiving brain spotting, kind of doing some of my own work during the training, while also practicing being the brain spotting therapist that way.
And so can you get CE credits for it? And how much does it cost?
Okay. So yes, you can get CEU credits for it. Absolutely. So there's a ton of trainings that are out there. If you want to become a certified brain spotter, you want to start with phase 1 and phase 2. They're each around that $795 mark for a 3-day. Usually, at least the trainer that I went with did hers on Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And so it was kind of nice that I didn't have to rearrange clients or travel anywhere. They are doing it online. And the beauty of brain spotting is that I have found that it's just as effective via telehealth as it is in person. I've done both. I'm about 50-50 with my clientele right now, in person and telehealth. And it doesn't matter. The results are the same or very similar across the board that way. So, yeah. But the training just talks about different setups that you can do because there's all different ways to go it. And I just love that it's flexible and you can change things out fluidly within the session. You're not stuck. going through any like structured protocol, like you do this and then you do this. It's not like that at all, which I really appreciate and I love.
Carol, we can see the excitement that you have just talking about brain spotting.
Yeah.
I think you need like a trading card that says, I'm a brain spotter. I think you use that language, right?
Yes. Yeah.
It's funny. I had a brain spotting session once when I was a client, and I think Carol and I were talking before this, and it's sort of like, I don't know that I was immensely invested in the process. So I think that there's still those elements that counselors need to do. It's not like brain spotting is the magic arrow or anything else. It's just another intervention that we can use. And I think this is part of the broader conversation about like counselors integrating neuroscience. Is it's not just like we throw everything that we've learned out the window. I think if anything, everything that we learned helps us use different techniques, different modalities in really clever and ethical and highly effective ways. And there's the joke that we always have when we talk about neurofeedback is there's a lot of different professions that do neurofeedback: chiropractors, MDs, neurologists, recreational therapists, counselors, etc. And I'm like, now who does neurofeedback in this way? And who does neurofeedback in this way? And I have to think that counselors with our training and, process experts and being strong relational experts, I have to think that we do neurofeedback a little bit differently. So I'd imagine, Carol, and I guess I'm curious you all too, like, do you think counselors would do brain spotting differently than another healthcare provider? Do you think we bring something unique to this integration?
Yeah, so I'll jump into that. The biggest sort of underlying foundation of brain spotting is the attunement between the therapist and the client. And so if nothing else, that is like the most important thing, because most of the brain spotting, like once you get trained in it, it's sort of one of those things where you're like, oh my gosh, is that simple? Like it's that I have to do, but you're really pouring so much of yourself as a therapist into being attuned with your client, which is, as we all know, is super, super important, which is why I think brain spotting is so exciting. I had a session where a client was identifying a spot that was kind of in front of me, like where I was sitting. And when I got up and left, because I was curious why that, we were focusing on that spot, I got up and moved and had them stay on that brain spot and asked them, well, what are you noticing now? And the response was, it feels empty. Like I feel abandoned. Like I feel like it was bringing all these things. And so I sat back down and I said, and what are you noticing now? They're like, it's comfortable, it's safe, it's safe. So it really speaks to, it was kind of an insight to me too, to be like, okay, so the relationship is definitely pulling and helping that client, but it's just another example of why it's so important foundationally that we have that relationship and rapport with our clients and that attunement. So I definitely think counselors are probably trained to be more focused on the relationship part of it, which is a benefit.
I can see brain spotting working with MRES. MRES is very similar in that it's so simple. And so most of the training is about attuning with the client. And also like neurofeedback, a lot of different practitioners are using MRES. And I think I can only think of 2 psychotherapists, including myself, that's using MRES. And it's so effective that it blows my mind that I can't get anyone else to join me on it. But that's also why I started their neuroscience route, to understand what's actually happening neurologically that can convince people to take another look at it and try it. But brain spotting, I could so see, because, as soon as you walk away and the client says, I feel abandoned, right there, I would use an MRES right there. Let's resolve that abandonment right here. Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah, now I'm excited because I need to look up more about MRES and figure out how I can incorporate that too. So this is great.
Well, the training's also really similar. The first weekend is 3 days, 2 8-hour days, 1 6-hour, 4-hour day, something like that. And then it's a second weekend. And then the certification comes after the third weekend. And then you can also learn how to work with clients in the first weekend, not get certified, but still have the tools to be able to work with people. But, I highly recommend going through the whole thing just because there's so much to learn and so many tricks, and everybody's so different that you have to be equipped,
Can I jump in with a question?
Yeah, we're waiting for you. Your microphone is unmuted. We're like, oh, what's Eric going to say?
I was going to type something, but no, I'll just throw it out there. Because, I'm listening to you all talk about these, like, even though it's simple, it's still kind of a new technical thing. We don't teach that in, graduate programs, at least not in the branded way. And I have to say there are, there's a lot of other like branded packages that use eye movements and things like that. Brain spotting is not the only one. EMDR is not the only one. And I think that Gina and I have been working on a project for a while, just trying to break down what it is about eye movements and really start thinking about how do we provide guidance on eye movements in general, or do we need to go through one of these like branded trainings in order to, be qualified or competent? So I guess when I'm thinking about integration of neuroscience, there's like this broad continuum, right? There's going to these 3-day trainings and learning these advanced techniques. And then there's also this side that Kiai is talking about of just digging into the literature and figuring out how this validates what I do. And I think for me, that really capitalizes like the ends of the continuum as we move from like our bottom line foundation of being an informed counselor is at least knowing what the literature says. So if the literature says something about the work that we do, then we probably ought to read it, whether it takes place in a psychodynamic journal or a neuroscience journal or whatever. I think that becomes like the bare minimum that we probably should be doing. And then on the other end, there's this like learning these completely new things that have emerged out of neuroscience. And I would put neurofeedback in that category. I would put brain spotting in that category. I would put accelerated resolution therapy. I would put neurosequential models in there. So it's just neat for me to hear about that full continuum. And I'm curious what you all think about, like, what role does this have in a master's level counselor's training? Like, should everybody be going out and getting brain spotting training, neurofeedback training? Should we be doing this in graduate programs? I'm just curious to hear your thoughts about where do you see us existing on that continuum from just knowing the literature to also doing these other like high-end techniques that cost a lot of money?
I took a creative therapies for trauma treatment, and I learned so much in this course. And I use these tools using art and just creative modalities. Why not a semester of neuroscience-backed practices, And now thinking about it, even the creative therapies don't have a lot of empirical research. So why are we not using, brain spotting and MRAS in practice?
Yeah, and I think that just speaks to, like, in the generality of it, we need more understanding of brain science, because not only to like inform our practice and what we're doing clinically, but I have found that just explaining the simple, somebody comes in PTSD, just explaining how the brain operates in those contexts gives clients a lot of like, okay, it's not just me. I'm not just making it up. I'm actually like, this makes sense and this makes me feel better. And okay, now how do we go about fixing it? But it brings a lot of relief that I have found being able, even in the most basic fundamental ways of neuroscience, like not having to go into the big words and, getting all caught up in like, how do I explain this the right way? But being able to do that has helped just with clients understanding and kind of buying into the counseling process a lot, I think. So I think it's super important that we should be. In my master's level training, we didn't talk about the brain at all. And that wasn't something I got until I went in for my PhD. Like that wasn't something, and I had to find those. Like they weren't in our classes. They were like when Brainstorm came out, I was like, oh, that sounds fascinating. I need to get in on that. It was those pieces where I had to do my own sort of advocacy for myself and learning. But I definitely think it should be somewhere included in our curriculum, even at the most foundational level. It doesn't have to be super technical, I don't think.
Even in our developmental course in graduate school, right? So I remember taking the developmental course and being like, what kind of information is this? I'm not really learning anything. We're learning a bunch of theories. What good is that? How about teaching us something we can actually use? And which brings me up to Eric and what Eric does. I'm curious to know how, because I saw your article on neurocounseling as a practice. I'm wondering how that's going. Are people catching on? And what do you see in the future in terms of schools beginning to take neurocounseling as a modality, as a approach?
What a big question, though. And I think that's part of, and I just think if you look developmentally at the counseling field as a whole, like, let's see, it was in 2000 that the first time I've ever found the term neurocounseling was in 2000, one little article, and it was really, really little. And essentially it just said that, hey, when our clients have more biologically based conditions, we should do this thing called neurocounseling. But it really wasn't like this is what neurocounseling was. It was just kind of, hey, we have clients that have more biologically driven things. We probably should treat it as something different rather than whatever else. And then fast forward to like early 2000s, and Alan Ivey is at ACA conferences saying we need to do this, we need to do this. And in 2014, there's a Counseling Today article. And that really kind of opened up a lot of opportunities, I think, just for some intentional focus. But, we're still at the counseling field as a whole, like, we've been highly specialized, and then we've been very general, and then we've been specialized, and then we've been general. And I think you watch this natural flow. I mean, it wasn't too long ago that we had to have an intentional focus on multiculturally informed counseling. Like, we had to call it a special thing because it wasn't so well ingrained yet. And you see that now with trauma-informed counseling too. Like, it has to be a special thing until it doesn't need to be a special thing anymore. And I think you see that evolution sort of continuing in that trend now in terms of neuroscience informed counseling, of just like, it needs to be its own thing until it doesn't need to be its own thing anymore, until it becomes so integrated. And I think there's still debate, though, about should it be integrated. And I think that's a debate worth having with folks, especially when I ask the question about why don't we have more at the master's level, the question is always, our master's degree is already way too long anyway, that I don't want to add a single other standard to it. But I think something that Kiai, you said really perked my interest of, maybe it's not about adding things, but it's just reorganizing and repackaging things. And I think that we're at a phase in like the broader psychotherapy world where, like, I think we're starting to organize techniques and interventions based on the processes that they impact rather than the theory that it came from. And I really think that's I don't know, maybe the counseling field has a little bit to grow in terms of, like, I don't know that we need to teach the canon of theory in as much detail as we still do. I think theory and history and all that has a large place in what we do. I think there's just so much more modern perspective on old theory and more technical expressions of those theory that I think we could, I'm not saying kick other things out, but I think we could reorganize the focus that we put on certain things. And maybe that's the way I see it becoming more integrated, is if we do repackage and redescribe. And I think ultimately for me, and folks may disagree with this, but when I talk about neuroscience informed counseling, I really do talk about it from a theoretical perspective, just like anything else. It's, what do theories give us? They give us language. They give us a way to describe the human experience, much like cognitive behavioral therapy, psychodynamic therapy. They give us language to describe the human experience. I don't view neuroscience informed counseling as anything different. Some people would say it's more concrete, it's more objective, it's more superior. I don't necessarily view it that way. I think they're all constructs, they're all variables that still need to be evaluated with the highest degree of scrutiny and science to evaluate it. And I think that's kind of where we're at in this place of, just really defining what the terms even mean, because until we define what the term means, how are we going to train somebody in it?
Yeah, I'm actually on the other side of that, and not just the theory, but the facts. I've had clients with PTSD, and I'm going to throw in how I got into neuroscience in the first place is because I had PTSD for 18 years, and my therapists had no idea how to explain to me what PTSD was. I had to figure it out on my own. And so I ended up going to my therapist and say, oh, this is what I learned about PTSD. This is what happened to my brain. And so I think it's really important if we're working, with people that we know exactly, well, okay, I know, Eric, this is not what you're saying, but in my opinion, for some people, it's important. I had one client who was born in El Salvador, and her parents had no idea that she had PTSD. And so I had to explain to them, this is what PTSD, this is what happens to the brain. And then they understood and were kind to her. So yes, I think there's extremes there.
I just love this conversation, and I have to jump in here because I recently defended a dissertation on Monday, and Eric remembers this was a central topic of our discussion as well. Is first of all, how do you define it? And second of all, what purpose does it serve in counselor education? And I think that having a good layout of the literature, having a good understanding of what's out there and how we can synthesize that and then apply it to counseling helps. And hearing Kiai and Carol talk about how this has implemented with clients, hearing your clients' narratives, hearing your own personal narratives, really speaks to the point that I was hoping to get at with my dissertation, in that it can provide relief for some clients to know this is what's biologically happening, right? We don't have to feel like this is pathological. We don't need to feel like this is an abnormal response. This is absolutely normal and expected, and here's what's happening. Now, that might not be the best for every single client, right? Some clients might not care or might not want to know, and that's fine, but that's where that attunement that Carol and Kiai, you were talking about, comes in too. So I appreciate those client stories, because that helps support what I've been trying to get at with some of my research too.
And don't hear me downplaying the relief piece. Those stories are all there, just like they are with others. And I think that's the evidence that needs to be collected still, because the $1 million question, if you will, is always, so what? Like, I've been doing psychotherapy for 45 years with great outcomes. Why should I do it any differently? And that's always the question that we'll continue to have when any new thing comes out is, how can we, justify doing this instead of this? And I think that's why I like to take the theoretical approach, is because it's not so much about necessarily redoing everything that you learned. It's just doing what you know in maybe a more nuanced way with a little bit of a different justification for it. And I think that's where I look at the evolution. You mentioned trauma-informed counseling. Like, trauma was kind of like the sneaky way in for neuroscience sometimes, because a lot of the trauma-informed approaches have this like neurobiological component at the foundation of it, right? So I think sometimes when you hear trauma-informed, it's kind of also a neuroscience-informed way of looking at things too, that we've extrapolated to be a little bit more broader to the human experience. So I think that's just the place we're at, defining it. What do we mean? When I say I'm doing neuroscience-informed counseling, what the hell do I mean? And then we can test it, but until we define what we mean, we're just going to be kind of picking at straw, or like just kind of, having these conversations again. So it'd be really easy to define brain spotting and design a study and see if brain spotting works. But what does that mean for a counselor? Is that neuroscience-informed counseling, or is that brain spotting? And what's the difference between the two? And maybe this ties back to how we started our conversation today about, like, what does a counselor bring to this highly technical thing that's different than the other providers that might do it? And I think that's really the definition. I guess really part of the definition that's important to me is thinking about, what does it mean to call myself neuro-informed? And if I'm going to call myself that, then how am I going to justify it? And how could I explain that to someone else? And I bet we would have 4 different answers if we probably asked ourselves in this room.
And if you think about, brain spotting is helping people, right? So why doesn't brain spotting inform the neuroscience community? So maybe neuro-informed means we're informing the neuroscience community. We should be. So I'm actually, where are you being trained by brain spotting anyway, Carol?
So right now it's online. So there is a brain spotting conference in July that is going to be in Denver, but you can also participate in it online. But all the trainings that I did in particular were online. There are some that are kind of all over. Brainspotting.com is their main site. I'm pretty sure they also have links to research on the website too, since brain spotting is relatively newer in the realm of things. So, but it has all the trainings. There's different trainers that are out there. Dr. David Grand, who discovered brain spotting, is still giving trainings and stuff too, which is awesome. And yeah.
See, brain spotting has an advantage because, he has a PhD, I'm assuming?
Yes.
Or is he okay. Yeah. So someone with a PhD has discovered brain spotting is now, I don't have a PhD. I have a master's, and it's not easy. I just submitted an article to a second journal because I got rejected by the first one. It was the most encouraging rejection, but so yeah.
Yeah.
Rejections are common. That's part of the game with all that. So don't let it discourage you at all, Kiai.
Yeah, but that does speak to like the difficulty in getting this information out to clinicians who really are the ones that need it. Because who are the ones that are reading those academic journals most of the time? Those Eric may or may not agree with me. I'm not sure what the shaking of the head meant. But it's those of us who are in higher education, who are professors, who are doing that work. We're the ones who have access to it. It's not, that's the thing that I've noticed now that I'm sort of out of the academic realm and just focusing on my clinical work, which is where my heart is. It's very hard for me to get this information. Even just doing, Google Scholar searches, doing that stuff, because that's really all I have. I don't have access to the libraries that I used to have through the university. So that's where the harder part is. So I do appreciate, like I said, I'm pretty sure brainspotting.com has their research articles related to brain spotting on their website, which is amazing because that means that you can go and access them. They also gave, during the trainings, they give you those. Like I have articles that were given to me in my training manual and stuff that were included in it. So that's helpful, but it's really hard as a clinician to even have access to the research in those articles. So that's the frustrating part.
And that was the motivation behind the brainstorm community, is really trying to provide that bridge. And I know Carol's mentioned that a few times. Kiai was there last week, and Gina's been there. So for those of you that don't know, Brainstorm is just a neuroscience community in the helping professions. And we have a monthly meeting where we distribute an article ahead of time, and we invite the author into our live meeting where we sometimes have a formal presentation, sometimes have a demonstration, sometimes just have a conversation. There is one CE assigned to the first hour, and then we do stick around for a half hour of just processing, like, what does this look like for you? And it really is supposed to be that sort of clinical application piece. Let's think through this clinically. And I think one of the things I wasn't really, expecting was, as we had some like basic science neuroscientists come to Brainstorm, they really valued having the clinician perspective, looking at the research, because they don't have that. They're looking at in a very like narrow lab setting without a lot of understanding. Not that they don't appreciate it, but just not a lot of experience to be able to say, this is what this would actually look like when operationalized by real life people. So Kiai, you're talking about like, I don't know if I'm ever going to get this published. And I'm like, that's the relationship that needs to continue to happen, is the academic community partnerships and the clinician academic partnerships. Because I think until those things, I mean, I think that's the cycle of science there. And, you know, PhD or no PhD, you're all researchers in my mind, because you ask questions and you seek out data and you try to answer it. And now we're just talking about another data point to go alongside of all the other data points. And I think that's just something I like to highlight, is like, at least from my perspective, like an EEG reading is going to be just as important as my client telling me how they feel. No one is going to be viewed as more superior or more accurate than the other. Like all data, we look at those points of convergence and divergence, and we help our clients explore what that means within their unique context of who they are. You know, and I think that's the real exciting part for me is, you know, when sometimes people will talk about, you know, it being too reductionistic or, you know, things like that, you know, I think it expands rather than reduces. And I would promote exploring rather than explaining. And you all have talked about like neuroeducation as a specific skill set, which I think is really, really important. I think there's some risk in neuroeducation too, as we see play out in the research. But again, I think that's research that counselors did not participate in. And I have to think that our values and our training help us do neuroeducation, which would be a specific type of psychoeducation, but focusing on neuroscience principles. I have to think we would do it differently to some degree. Otherwise, why are we a profession if we're just going to do it the same way that everybody else is going to do it?
Yes, and I think that responsibility of how do we integrate this into the counseling world, how do we educate other counselors on this, is really, really important. So I feel like this is a natural segue into one of our questions from the live audience. So we had someone ask, what are your recommendations regarding reviewing the literature on brain spotting, which Carol, you've already somewhat answered. And I'm going to invite you to answer a little bit more on that. But the second part of that question is then, where can I obtain more information about neuroscience training within counselor education and supervision? So we'll take a minute to answer that.
Yeah, so like I said, I'm pretty sure, and hopefully nobody goes on there and tells me I'm wrong, that brainspotting.com has links to the research articles that are out there. Also, get involved or look at, you know, I had a faculty member that was hardcore honest about look at Twitter and follow like the people that are doing research there. I'm part of brain spotting Facebook groups that are private groups for clinicians and practitioners who are doing that, but I'm part of a brain spotting research specific group that is also talking about the research that people are looking at doing, ideas that people have, and sharing that. So absolutely, sometimes just going directly to the source, so to speak. Sometimes you can find some good links that way.
Yeah, if there are researchers you want to like stay informed with, I think Carol, following their Twitter is something. I've not ever really got engaged in Twitter, but I know that's a healthy resource that you might find useful. Any sort of social media outlet, but most researchers, especially sort of high-end, well-funded researchers, are going to have a lab page, and their lab page is normally going to have all their publications. So, you know, if you're thinking about like, this is a researcher that I want to know what they're doing, then, you know, use your little bookmark in your toolbar of your whatever web browser you use. And I think that's a nice place. You know, there are certain copyright restrictions that, you know, make it really challenging. And that's the whole push for like the open access movement. And does higher education get to hold all the knowledge anymore when they already charge too much money for their degrees? That might sound weird for me to say, but I'm thinking about Carol's comment earlier of I got out, and sometimes that's what it feels like, right? You know, so I think that, you know, the time where higher education was the only source of knowledge is just over, you know, and I think connecting knowledge to people, connecting it to clinicians, and also connecting it just to the general public. And let's be honest, there are people that are not clinicians that are way better at communicating about mental health on TikTok and Instagram and everything else than I will ever be, and than many counselors will ever be. And I think there's that same concern about that Gina talked about in terms of responsibility, you know, because the popular press approach to neuroscience and research would show us is that people believe stuff if it's attached to neuroscience more even if it's inaccurate, and I think that there's a responsibility we have to create accessible content, but also content that's accurate, whether it be in a one-to-one counseling session or in a broader macro sort of public health intervention, sort of educate the people kind of thing. And I guess that's why I like that we're governed by ethical principles, whereas a social media influencer might not be, but I don't know that anyone is better or worse than the other. And I just wish that we could find ways to marry the communication strategies in a way that helps us accomplish the things that we want, which is promoting the health and well-being of those that we serve.
One thing about neuroscience, though, is that the evidence keeps changing or the evidence is pointing in different directions because the brain is so, we used to think emotion was right here, but now we're finding emotion is everywhere. And it's like, I think some people may even be a little hesitant to read too much into it because it's changing, because we're learning more. But yes, I think getting that information out is really important. And it is unfortunate that counselors in general don't have library access. I mean, come on, like our schools should be providing that access to us so that we can read whenever we want to. I actually signed up for a course this summer, not just to have library access, but pleased to discover I have library access just from taking one course. So little clue if anyone really wants that access. Oh, but then there's LibGen also. Do you guys know LibGen? It's libgen.rs is the Russian site, but it's basically access to scholarly libraries. So through LibGen, you can access a lot of journals. I have no idea how it works and who pays for it, but something to check for sources.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think, just hearing what all of you are talking about and the challenges that we're facing with some of this stuff and some of the moral responsibility and some of the ethics around it too, it's important to consider. And like Kiai, you just mentioned, the evidence keeps changing, right? So how do we define that? And can we define, exactly where emotion is within the brain? Can we define exactly what's happening in specific regions of the brain or whatever? And I don't have an answer to that, but I think that that's some of the big questions to be asking as we're looking at this literature and stuff like that.
I think we totally can learn more just from practicing MRES. I think that, I'm itching to find somebody with an fMRI to be able to look at a person's brain as we're doing an MRES session, because you literally watch somebody change before your eyes. And for people who don't know what MRES is, it's very similar to somatic experiencing, where you pay attention to your body's sensations when you're having this emotion. And the difference between somatic experiencing and which is by Dr. Peter Levine, and MRES, which I can't really go into the history right now. It's probably a tangent, but the difference is in its protocols. Somatic experiencing was made for people who have trauma backgrounds. And so there's a lot of work in becoming certified in somatic experiencing, whereas MRES, you can get certified in 3 weekends and you can deal with all kinds of emotional difficulties. And you can also use MRES within Ericksonian hypnotherapy, which has been, for me, the thing that has really helped people transform the most. I don't know if you have time to go into that, but.
Well, Kiai, that brings up like the point I think we've danced around a little bit too, is like people have been doing Ericksonian hypnotherapy for 40, 50 years, right? With great outcomes. So like, what would someone say is like, well, now because we know about X, Y, and Z from neuroscience research, you can be this kind of Ericksonian hypnotherapist. And I wonder how, like, is that necessary? And that's really the looming question about, would a neuroscience informed Ericksonian hypnotherapist get any better outcomes than a non-neuroscience informed Ericksonian hypnotherapist? And I think that's a really interesting question that we haven't yet to answer. And Gina, I don't know if you remember what we talked about in your defense the other day, but it was kind of dancing around that idea of, we've been trying to figure out if CBT is better than psychodynamic, if psychodynamic is better than Gestalt, et cetera, for decades. And what do we find out? Really doesn't matter, because it all comes back to the common factors in therapeutic relationship, right? Which I guess gets me back to this idea of, can counselors integrate neuroscience differently than other professions that do? And if so, then maybe there's something here that the counseling profession can sort of, I don't know that we have necessarily, but I think we can continue to think about, what does our unique professional values bring to what will only continue to be an increasingly neuroscience informed mental health field. And that's the other concern, is like, we can learn the language and participate in creating what it looks like, or we can wait. And hopefully that we can, hopefully we have a scope of practice at some point that allows us to do it. But who knows, Carol, you might learn brain spotting and 10 years down the road, oh, look, that's only in someone else's scope of practice now. So I think there's some interesting advocacy and policy related issues wrapped up in all of this. Carol, you're shaking your head. I want to hear what's bouncing around there.
Yeah, so this is sort of, I guess, one of those things that we talked about at a training. So for example, I know, like, if you are a clinician working with insurance, certain things like EMDR can be billed at a higher rate. Okay. So getting into those things, whereas brain spotting can't. Like, it's just a normal CPT code for your time, whatever. And so thinking about, I guess maybe this is somewhat of a tangent, but bringing it into that, it's, now I've lost my thought. My thought's gone. Maybe it'll come back to me, but it's gone. Yeah.
Well, I think I can maybe fill in a little bit. This is why we need to do the research, right? And this is why I got into neuroscience, because it's like, the research isn't there yet for what we do and for what we know is effective. And other people who I'm sure are listening right now are afraid to try if the empirical evidence isn't there to show that it works. There are not a lot of risk takers out there. Carol, you and I are the risk takers. We're the ones who are like, the pioneers. And Eric, I think, do you do neurofeedback? Yeah. So, by the way, I had a neurofeedback session, and at the time I can't remember what I was struggling with, something to do with PTSD, but one session of neurofeedback, and my head was literally buzzing. It was vibrating, and it was amazing. Just one session. I was told that you usually need like multiple sessions for neurofeedback. It only took me one session to be like, oh my gosh, I can remember things. Oh, that's what it was. I was having trouble remembering things.
It works. Look, now you remember it. That's the question. That brings up something else. Two things, Carol. What you're talking about, CPT codes and billing, and like coming back to this idea of like language. And I can't tell you how many people, when we talk about this, they're like, oh, you're doing neuropsychology. And I'm like, no, that's an entirely different field and profession that's regulated. Do not say that I'm doing neuropsychology, because then I'll get a cease and desist letter, or I'll get called up on ethical codes. That is not what I'm doing. But I think it's that whole idea of like, if we don't define it, then other people are going to define it for us. And I think that's really been the push from a leadership perspective, I guess. And I mean, obviously I'm biased, but I will give credit to the American Mental Health Counselors Association for making a home in the journal for neuroscience informed publications and creating the first biological bases of behavior standards, which are kind of the de facto neuroscience competencies that exist in our field. And frankly, small percentage even know that they exist. And I think that those are some things that, like, if we're talking about ethical practice, like, these are really important considerations, because when it comes back to what Carol's talking about billing, like, what am I billing for? Am I billing for a neuropsychological intervention? I hope you're not, because that's probably going to get you in trouble one of these days. But so that's what I'm saying is, how do we define what we're doing? Because if it is neuroscience informed counseling or counseling with a neuroscience theoretical lens, like, it's still, well, we could get a little bit tricky here. We don't bill for counseling either. We bill for psychotherapy. So we'd have to have that whole conversation as well. But that's for another roundtable, right?
Yeah, and I think that this is a really important conversation to have just in terms of billing and everything. And Kiai, I want to bring up what you just said too about the research side. So I just finished a research study involving some of these things, and I could talk for a long time about some of the challenges that I face doing that. And Eric could too. I'm sure you might know it better than I do after the year that you've spent with me on this. But it's definitely been a challenge. And we don't know, I don't know personally if that work is going to be published, how easy it will be to get that work published. I know that, Eric, you were just talking about some of the possible homes for that type of work and that kind of thing, but this is the type of research that needs to reach clinicians. These are the types of things, the objective, quantitative, and also qualitative, combining the two. That's going to be what's most important in informing.
Well, you'll have that posted somewhere online, right? Because I cite dissertations, or I have when I was in school. So it's valuable anyway. So somebody's going to find it.
Yeah, and I think that's part of it, right? All dissertations are published, I think, in ProQuest and things like that. I don't know. I'm just going through all of that now as I'm wrapping this up and trying to get it all in and everything. And I think that again, like you said, I also cite a lot of dissertations. I also referenced a lot of dissertations as I was writing that. And I think that it's important work, and those kinds of things can help circulate that knowledge a little bit better.
Oh, and by the way, just for all the listeners out there, you don't have to have a PhD to do research. I think Eric mentioned that already. But however, I have to say that there is stuff to learn when you go through the journal submission process. That I am planning to write an article on that, because I was asking. I think I wrote to Eric too. I was like, "Oh, can you be a peer reviewer?" And then I was like, "Oh wait, no, you can't." So. Yeah, lots of barriers, but there are ways to learn and be a researcher. Even, you're learning something in your practice, you're seeing something that works with clients. Please write about it. I think it's really important to share that kind of knowledge with each other.
Yeah, I gotta elevate that, and I hope I'm doing better, Marty. Marty told me to get closer to the microphone, so sorry if I was giving you all a lot of background earlier. But yeah, I agree, Kiai. I mean, you are all researchers, whether you're, an IRB-backed researcher. You all develop questions in your mind, you collect data, and you try to answer those questions. And I think if you partner with someone at a university that can make that like somewhat reviewable from an institutional review board standpoint, great. Even if it's a single subject design kind of study. I mean, our field thrives on N of one, not thrives, but our field values N of one studies that can bring some rigor to anecdotal evidence that we see every day. And I think some people have differing views of what it even means to be evidence-based, and I think that's, there used to be the evidence-based registry, and they got rid of that for I think, and some people were worried when they got rid of that. I think there's good reason why perhaps something like that doesn't need to always be there, because I think if you look at the Institute of Medicine and you look at the American Psychological Association's definition of evidence-based practice is just the best available research evidence, your clinical experience, and clients' cultural responsivity. So there's this kind of like three-prong approach to evidence-based practice that doesn't say you have to follow this study that's had 12 randomized control trials in this exact way, or you're not doing evidence-based practice. I don't think that's the way it's ever been intended. So I know sometimes, Kiai, you talked about like people might be scared to go for it, and yeah, maybe there's the need for a little bit of ethical restraint at times, right? And I think that's probably good, but even our code of ethics allow for innovation as long as we are upfront in our informed consent. We would do that anyway, and Carol, I'm sure you have a whole spiel you go through for informed consent about brain spotting and how that fits into who you are as a counselor. And I think, Carol, that's probably a case study about how you start to distinguish your role as a counselor versus your role as a brain spotter versus how do those come together. And I think that's a really important just discussion from a counselor identity standpoint, from a scope of practice standpoint, an informed consent standpoint. Who would have known we would have gotten to the nooks and crannies of informed consent? But like, I just think that's so valuable. And Carol, like, I want to see you write about that.
Yeah, and that the evidence-based, label came up in our trainings too, because lots of people, or even in this the Facebook group where practitioners are saying, what do I say to peers who tell me that this isn't evidence-based? What do I say to them about brain spotting? And I think that's where the problem is because we know anecdotally that this works. There is research out there that has looked at the effectiveness of this and has, gone through the rigor of scientific study that has shown us, but it's newer and there's not as much as compared to, EMDR who's been around longer or whatever. But that is a struggle for clinicians too, is okay, well, this doesn't have the evidence-based stamp of approval. I'm not doing that, when it could potentially be something that is super effective and super helpful for clients. I've had clients who have had a SUDS level of disturbance at a 7 go down to a 0 in one session, brain spotting session. I mean, that's amazing. Those are results. And then they come back and they're like, hey, I can even talk to you easier about this now. I noticed I could actually sleep the last 2 weeks since I saw you last. And it's like, what better evidence do I need that this works? So that evidence-based label is troublesome sometimes.
Let's remember, everything was innovative until it wasn't, right? Like, I mean, everything has to start somewhere, and I think there's reason to be, again, practice ethical restraint, not out there going, I hope willy-nilly is an okay phrase. It's in my culture, we talk about willy-nilly all the time. Just going out there all willy-nilly, doing whatever you want, but it's, as long as you're informed by the best available evidence that's there. There's bukus of evidence about eye movements in a lot of different emotional processing models now that, I would say that eye movements do something, and that there's emerging evidence that are starting to help us precisely say what eye movements do. But I'm going to tie this back to my theoretical comments. I don't know why an empty chair technique works, and it does. Does that stop me from using the empty chair technique? Hell no. I love it. I love me a good old-fashioned empty chair technique. Bust out a miracle question, who knows? I don't know why those work, but they do. So same thing, like, maybe I don't know why holding a wand and having my clients move their eyes, I don't know exactly why that works, but there's enough evidence to support it. And I'm not doing it just saying that, I'm not selling snake oil out there and say, you will be healed when I move my wand like this. Like, and I think that's that overstatement that gets people in trouble. Like, that's the real risk in what we do when we say we're integrating neurosciences, and when we're making false claims and we're overstating things and at work, and a lot of times, unintentionally, but I think that's really where the ethical restraint piece comes in, is just not overstating what we do, and saying, hey, there's evidence to support that emotions might come from this place, and this might be what you're experiencing, rather than, oh, this is what happens when you have depression, and this is what's going on in your brain, and you have a chemical imbalance, and all those things that are, highly inaccurate to some degree. But I think that's where, I don't know, I think that's really where we're at, is just defining a little bit more clearly what it means to be neuroscience informed and what doesn't. And I see the question down in the from one of our viewers about just defining even what is neuroscience, because that's an inaccurate term too, because it's really like, what kind of neuroscience? Because there's at least 15 branches of neuroscience, and every field has had neuro whatever. There's neurotheology, there's neuromarketing, there's neuro counseling, there's neuro everything. So it's not like, even just saying neuroscience doesn't really tell us anything. Kiai, you mentioned neurofeedback. I'd say the same thing. I'd say, what kind of neurofeedback? Because there's so many different kinds of neurofeedback that I don't know what you mean when you say I had neurofeedback. So I think that's where, like, just getting our language together, I think, would be a huge first step. And to the person that posted that, thank you for posting that. The definition that myself and colleague Chad Luke use for an upcoming chapter we wrote is the study of the complete human nervous system and its interactions with the full scope of environmental and developmental variables, because it's not just an internal thing. It's the way that our nervous system interacts with the nervous systems around us, as well as environmental exposures and everything that goes on in the world, and our microbiome and our soil and our food and everything else. So, you know, that is purposely broad for some reason, but it's also, you know, about expanding it to really allow us to do what we want to do from a theoretical perspective and say, how does this fit in? And I'm gonna stop.
I think it's broad because we've known so little about it for so long. It was just a lot of, well, it was philosophers talking about what is emotion, right? So now we're at a place where we can actually look at what the brain is doing with emotion, and there's even more of our neurological system that we don't even talk about. For example, endorphins. Dr. Candace Pert in the 1980s discovered the endorphin receptor, and there's all of this discovery. They discovered more than 50 neuropeptides, neurotransmitters in the 80s, and yet it's so hard to find a neuroscience article on neuropeptides, you know, unless it's something to do with in the medical field. I tried to find psychology articles about neuropeptides, and I couldn't find any. And it's like, well, we need to be studying neuropeptides in psychology. So this is a new field, and it's going to be a new branch of study. So yes, how do you define neuroscience? It's not easy.
We got another question about, I don't want to field all of these. It says, what is neurocounseling too? But
well, I think I can answer that based on your article, which your article had said that neurocounseling is basically having some information to give to the client that's about our neurology, and having a physiological, giving a physiological basis for what the client is going through, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually finalizing a chapter, and I could read exactly what's in there. But
please do.
You know, and I'm not sure I agree with what I wrote in 2017 anymore too. And I think that's the nature that Kiai talks about in terms of just, you know, I think it would be wrong for me to say I believe everything I did in 2017, right? I think that things happen and research evolves, and we look at this process, you know, in a really dynamic way. But, you know, going back to, again, 2000 was the first time I've ever found the term neurocounseling. And again, a really narrow definition of just, it's the counseling we do when we work with people whose presenting concerns are more biologically based. And they talked about it in terms of ADHD. And that was all, you know, 2000, just like, oh, maybe we should call this something different. Montez wrote in Counseling Today in 2014, The Birth of the Neurocounselor, and interviewed some leaders in the field about what that looked like. But again, there really wasn't an operational definition until Lori Russell Chapin in 2016, and this is a quote from the Journal of Mental Health Counseling, the integration of neuroscience into the practice of counseling by teaching and illustrating the physiological underpinnings of many of our mental health concerns. And then my colleague and I, Tom Field, expanded on that a little bit and said, and we called it a specialty within the counseling field in 2017. And I'm not sure I agree with that statement anymore. So I said it then, so I'll leave it in. But this next part, I still do enjoy, defined as the art and science of integrating neuroscience principles related to the nervous system and physiological processes underlying all human functioning into the practice of counseling for the purpose of enhancing clinical effectiveness across the entire counseling process with a focus on wellness promotion. And that's 2017, but even we've kind of, you know, and there's different opinions about neurocounseling versus neuroscience informed counseling. And I think I've probably landed more on the neuroscience informed counseling side of things for the reasons I talked about in the very beginning. And really, I look at that on three phases. One is just, you read neuroscience literature and you ask yourself, does this validate what I already do? Kiai, you talked about that. Like I was searching for some understanding about why what I did was working. So, I think if you do that, you're a neuroscience informed counselor because you're reading neuroscience literature and you're saying, hey, this validates what I do. Good on you. Number two, you start to edit and refine what you do based on what you're reading. I call myself a recovering cognitive behavioral theorist sometimes. And I say that because like neuroscience taught me a lot about cognition, emotion, and feeling that I do cognitive behavioral therapy different now. And colleagues and I have been working on neuroscience informed cognitive behavioral therapy. So, you can read stuff and it can validate what you do. That's great. You can refine what you do. That's great. And then you can create new things, and I don't know that I'll ever be maybe we'll all be in this place where we create something new. But I think a lot of us are learning new things that people have created, like brain spotting, like neurofeedback, like accelerated resolution therapy, like all of these other new packages, somatic experiencing that Kiai talked about. There's all these packages now that I think are grounded in very similar neuroscience principles. Most of those are about bottom-up processing and just body first work. That isn't new either. Like that's been around for decades as well. But I think it grew out of favor with the cognitive revolution of psychotherapy for a long time. And now we're coming back to connect a lot of the dots. And really, I think neuroscience is helping us connect a lot of those dots from theory to theory to theory. And I think that's where the repackaging and the redefinition of things, like it is starting to happen to some degree. I don't know that it's going to filter back into a counseling theories textbook for a while. And that's I'm not going to say unfortunate, maybe that's the unfortunate part. I don't know. The field should define that for us.
Well, I think part of that is because it's what schools are teaching counselors is not neurological, we're not learning neurology in school. So, but we can do it on our own. We can push for it. Everyone should, if you're in school, call up your schools and say, hey, we need to learn more about neurology, right?
Well, in the few classes that I've taught with neuroscience, it seems to me that students are hungry for this type of knowledge. Every time I've ever lectured about it, every time I've done a guest speaking engagement about it, people have been very, very interested. I've gotten a lot of positive feedback. I've gotten a lot of engagement from students. And so I think there is a place there. People are asking for it. And I think it's important to fit that, but do it responsibly, like we've been talking about tonight. And just going off of what Eric talked about with that neurocounseling lens, what is neurocounseling and how do we define it? Again, in the literature, it doesn't come up all that often. And I know this because I just wrote about this and did that search again, and it was from 2014, and it's still not that advanced today. There's a few more, but not horribly much. And I think there were only like 6 or 7 within counseling itself where that term is coming up. So I think understanding and figuring out how we can operationalize those definitions and how we can do some more on the ground, actual evidence-based research is going to help inform, and again, this is my personal bias on how I view research. Research informs practice and practice informs research. And it's this cyclical nature, which is why I think it's important to engage in both, and why those barriers are particularly frustrating, but something that we need to do.
So now I have a question for the 3 of you. What made you want to get a PhD?
Mine's a really simple, easy answer. Since I specialize in working with individuals with chronic pain and chronic illness, and I have worked in a hospital setting, doctors never took me seriously when I had that MS after my name. I really needed that fancy doctor title to get a seat at the table from a psychology perspective. And so really, and I may or may not have faculty watching this right now, sorry guys, but they knew when I got into my PhD, I told them, hey, the research is secondary. I'm really clinically focused and this is why I'm here. And unfortunately, I found that to be true. Once I got that fancy title, they started taking me a little more seriously. So.
You want me to go next, Eric? So Eric Beeson is one of the main reasons that I went to get a PhD. So I think all of you know, and for those of you listening, Eric has been one of my greatest mentors throughout this process. And when I was in my master's program, I had him as a professor, mentor. I think back then it wasn't called Emerging Scholars, but you were my faculty for doing research on things. And that's really what started me on the path to get my PhD. I wanted to be Eric when I grew up. And so I was like, he's an awesome professor. I want to be an awesome professor one day. And teaching and research is where my heart's at. So that's been something that, to get into that space and to break into that field, you have to have a PhD. So as of Monday, that's where I'm at.
Marty, Photoshop all this blushing out before you go online. Thank you. That's so kind, Gina. But I mean, I think, me, I'm just impulsive, I think is why I got my PhD. It was kind of always like on the table, but I was like, hey, I'm just going to Google what's going on. And within an hour's drive, and I found a counselor ed program. And I was like, sure, why not apply? And that's, the rest is kind of written from there. But, I don't know that there was any real motivation, as I'm just impulsive and I try to use it for my benefit rather than my destruction these days. So when I channel it in that direction, it seemed to work. But shame on us as a society that we place more value on people. I mean, based on degree time. I mean, I think that's evidence of a classist system, at work, right? And I think we'd probably be remiss if we didn't at least talk a little bit about justice on this conversation in terms of just, from a neuroscience perspective too, but I think this is really a higher education conversation now about just the privilege afforded to people based on a degree or a certain status. And, I think there's been a lot of justice elements in access to knowledge and who gets access to knowledge and who doesn't. So I guess I really appreciate that question, Kiai, because it brings us to that, I don't know, it kind of brings us roundabout of social media influencers communicating knowledge versus academics communicating knowledge versus who gets that right, who gets that privilege. And I think I hear a lot of folks often talking themselves like, I'm not credible enough. And, I guess from someone that has a PhD after their name is like you have hopes and dreams and knowledge and value and curiosity, and bring that curiosity to the table, whether it's in a formal setting or an informal setting. And I'm so sorry that, folks don't get those seats at a table, but at least here, I think we've illustrated pretty well that there are seats at the table for people without PhDs. And that was important to me in this conversation, because it can't just be us.
Thank you for that. And yeah, we lost Carol, unfortunately, but I feel unlike Carol that I don't feel like I've been shut off just because I don't have a PhD. But actually the opposite, that people are open to hearing what I have to say. I don't know if it's because I talk loud or or something, but no, actually, but now part of the problem is how do we get this research done? And I do want to take a neuroscience route, but just because it seems to be the way to have that evidence in front of our eyes through imaging equipment, and I don't have access to that imaging equipment. So I don't care to get a PhD, and I don't really, that's just not my goal. But I decided if I find a PhD program where the tuition is fully covered, I'll think about it. And it turns out neuroscience has openings for full scholarships. So anyone who's interested in getting a PhD, try neuroscience and use your psychology background, your counseling background and apply it to neuroscience, and let's get things going.
Yeah, and I think it's a great point. And unfortunately, we lost Carol. Her internet is down. I just received a text from her, so that's what happened to her. She's completely without internet. I told her to log back in, and she said she doesn't know what's going on. So hopefully, we'll see her before the end. But if not, I just want to speak a little bit, because her and I have had so many conversations about exactly what you're talking about, Kiai, with adding neuroscience to PhDs or going for a neuroscience PhD and trying to integrate some more of that. And so, yes, absolutely get out there and do that if some of you listening are interested. And also, if you're not interested in getting a PhD, definitely chat with us about research. It's a great thing. And we love partnerships. I love partnerships. And so thank you. Thanks for bringing that up. Okay, so I think Marty's telling me we have one more capstone question, it's like a big summary question. So so I'll ask Eric and Kiai, what are some takeaways that you have from our conversation tonight?
Don't be afraid to try new things. Don't be afraid to try new things. I think it's important for us as counselors to be creative with our clients, and it's okay to ask a client, is it okay if we try this? And let the client know there's no guarantee. And if you feel uncomfortable with it, we can stop and give the client the control, the final decision, and go for something. Go for trying. Pay attention to the sensations in your body. That's something I encourage counselors to ask their clients, because that can open up so many more questions and insights. I've had clients come to a session with practically no insight. We pay attention to their body sensations, and all of a sudden they have all these things to say. So, experiment, try, don't be afraid, be bold.
I just feel like every time I have these conversations, like I learn so much more, and it just expands your thinking. And I think along with what Kiai is saying about being bold and being curious is like, talk to people. I think that's what sometimes just holds people back, is like, people aren't going to want to hear what I say, or, folks don't want to, they don't want to be ridiculed, or they don't want to be seen as less than. And certainly, obviously, or maybe not obviously, but as a white cisgender male, I'm normally afforded a lot of opportunities to try and fail, whereas folks might not. So I want to understand that it's difficult to put yourself out there because of that fear, and so hear me when I say, like, that's my encouragement, because I really value your voice, and I want to hear your ideas, because it helps me think more and more about what I believe. And 3 years from now, I'm going to look back at this and say, I don't believe that shit anymore, right? I think something totally differently now. I don't know if that's true. I hope what we're talking about today has some staying power. And I think that, as Gina said, the eagerness is there. And I think, as Kiai said, it's just a matter of people finding that route that's going to help them get there. And for some, it might be a PhD. For some, it might be a specific master's degree. For some, it might just be doing what you do and connecting to a community, whether it's, I know I hate shameless plugs, but I'll give another one for the Brainstorm community, is just if you want to come and talk to people in an environment where I don't think folks will ridicule you, although I can't speak for them. I think, Kiai, you would speak that it's just an opportunity to talk about what you do. And get feedback on what you do, and maybe have people ask you hard questions, but it's all for the sake of promoting your own knowledge and your own understanding. So that's really what I encourage you to do, is similar to what Kiai said, is just really dream a little bit, be curious, and talk to people. I think that's probably that last piece, is just talk to people. And, Gina put herself out there. I'll put myself out there. I imagine Kiai would put herself out there too, but I won't speak for them. But just reach out, build connection. We're a relational field, build relationships with folks.
Absolutely. Yeah. So thank you so much to both of you for that. And I just want to echo what both of you said. And again, I hate to keep bringing this back to that pesky dissertation, but that was an experiment in putting myself out there. And I just want to tell everybody that you can do it. I had a lot of people tell me that I couldn't. I had a lot of people tell me this is not a good idea, especially during COVID. But I had some really good cheerleaders like Eric Beeson, who helped me to see that it was possible and that I could do it. And that's coming from someone who's not trained in anything neuroscience related. So definitely put yourself out there and don't be afraid to fail.
but she'll tell you everything there is to know about frontal alpha asymmetry now. So if you want to know about frontal alpha asymmetry, you send Gina Martin an email and she'll drop some knowledge on you.
That's right. Yes, that FAA and emotional dysregulation and ACEs. I sure know a lot about those variables. So thank you so much to each of our live audience members for joining us tonight. And thank you to our listeners and our subscribers of this podcast. And a huge warm welcome, or thank you. Sorry, wow. We're starting over at the beginning. But a huge warm thank you to both of you and to Carol, who says she's so sorry for not being able to log back on. Her internet is still completely down. So thank you so much to the three of you for your wealth of information, your depth of knowledge, and just your expertise in conceptualizing this very difficult to conceptualize field that we're talking about. So thank you, Dr. Eric Beeson, Dr. Carol Seehusen, and Kiai Kim. I've really appreciated the conversation tonight, and I've really, really appreciated your contributions.
And Dr. Gina Martin, have you said that out loud yet?
I know I briefly mentioned it to my students one day, and I was like, that sounds weird. Just call me Gina. I was telling Carol, maybe at the closing of this podcast, I'll say it. So for one final thing, thank you so much. My name is Dr. Gina Martin for the first time on live air. So you can learn more about this show at counselingdelphi.net. There are a few future topics that I want to mention. So coming in May, Dr. Elliot Ingersoll is going to lead a panel on the topic of treatment with psychedelic drugs. In June, we have Dr. Eric Perry leading a panel on the topic of establishing connections with students in a virtual space. So thank you so much again to our panel tonight, to our subscribers. Please come back next time for more. And that's it for this episode of Counseling Delphi.